and welcome to Global News Today, bringing exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, we're going to be looking at the impact of US tariffs on the United States and also the wider world. This after a federal court blocked most of President Donald Trump's tariffs this week. We're also going to be looking at the ongoing row between one of America's most prestigious institutions, Harvard University, and the Trump administration. Plus, we'll have our regular look back at the top US news and political stories. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with US tariffs. Now, this week, a US trade court blocked most of President Donald Trump's tariffs in a sweeping ruling, which found that the president had overstepped his authority. That decision came in response to a lawsuit in which the attorneys general of 12 states and several small American companies urged the court to strike down the import taxes. Well, President Trump's deputy chief of staff, Stephen Miller, accused the court of, quote, a judicial coup. And the White House issued a statement saying it was not for, quote, unelected judges to decide how to properly address a national emergency. So what now for the tariffs, and where does this leave the ongoing global trade war? Well, we can bring into the conversation Greg Swenson, who is the chair of Republican Overseas, who joins us now from Chicago. Greg, great to have you with us here on Al Arabiya English once again. Just tell us what was ruled by the federal court and what it changes.
Well, the important thing to keep in mind here, Tom, is that the court has basically said that the president can't use emergency power. So it's not that they're opining on tariffs specifically, but just the use of that emergency power. You know, by declaring an emergency, he can impose tariffs, and that is where they think that he overstretched. So I think ultimately it will be overturned. You know, this ruling will be overturned by higher courts. This is kind of an obscure court that no one's ever heard of, but they do have a point. You know, the question is this truly an emergency? The president thinks so. I think others would object to that.
Some, obviously, critics of the Trump administration dubbing this a major setback for President Trump, others calling it a massive embarrassment. Is it either of those things, or is it just a mild inconvenience?
I don't think so. I think it's more the mild inconvenience, Tom. I think it's a speed bump in the process. He's pushed the envelope on a bunch of different issues. He's willing to do that. He's provocative. He's unorthodox in a very good way, in my view. And so he's going to do that in just about, with just about every issue that's on the table. So I think this will be a minor setback, probably overturned. And I would hope that Congress actually gets involved, because other than an emergency situation, tariffs should be part of the congressional activity, not necessarily the executive branch.
As we were saying in the introduction, the White House has hit out at these judges, saying it's not for unelected judges to properly decide how to address a national emergency. And I'm just wondering how you see this playing out in the court of public opinion, and do you see this perhaps resulting in something of a backlash against the judges?
I would think so, because this is another case of judicial activism or legislating from the bench. You know, the laws should be decided or legislated by the Congress, by the House of Representatives and the Senate, not by unelected judges. So if they're opining on whether something is constitutional or not, that's fine, and that's up to the Supreme Court ultimately. But yeah, this is another case where anything that President Trump does, the progressive left will oppose it, even if it's a positive thing. They will never give him credit. So this is just another case of activist judges ruling against anything they can possibly rule against when it comes to President Trump.
Okay, this does, you call it a speed bump, but it does raise quite a lot of questions for where quite a lot of people stand around the world. And where are we with those tariffs? Are they suddenly no longer applicable? There's a bit of a limbo, isn't there, here?
It is. I think you've seen the UK has already come out and said, they're taking a wait and see approach, which I think is wise. I think this is not going to end, in the next day, but it's surely not going to take more than a few weeks. So I think you'll see probably a lot of our trading partners take hit the pause button, but not necessarily, go back to the original table of negotiating. I think it's just a pause right now.
I mean, could this play to the advantage of countries other than the United States? And I wanted to give you the example of Japan. I gather they're on round 4 of their trade talks, and their auto sector obviously severely impacted by the US tariffs. I mean, do you see those talks perhaps just not continuing until there's a bit more clarity? Or do you think the Japanese will say this is our opportunity to perhaps negotiate with a couple more Trump cards up our sleeve?
Yeah, they possibly could do that. Although I think most will take the path of what the UK has said is just, let's just wait and see. I think ultimately the president will have that power to negotiate on tariffs if Congress doesn't step in. He's using these emergency powers as, kind of a tool to get his policy through. And, there is some argument to be made that it is an emergency if you're running a $300 billion trade deficit, or you're outsourcing and basically importing cheap and slave labor from China. There's a lot of arguments to be made that this is a crisis, but that's ultimately going to be up to the Supreme Court. And this, lower court is basically, as I said earlier, rejecting anything that they can possibly reject because it's coming from this president.
So you basically think perhaps in some respects the Trump administration chose the wrong national emergency by sort of pinning everything on the influx of drugs from foreign countries. They should have instead focused on a different type of national emergency to make it hold water.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tom, and I think ultimately that's why I think they should go to the Congress to do this, and that way it will be according to traditional constitutional plan or the power of different branches of government. Tariffs fall with Congress, and they could do that immediately. They could do it today. They could do it in 15 minutes if they chose to, and that's why I think that might push them ultimately to act on tariffs. But in the meantime, the president's using this Emergency Powers Act to do so. And, he has a point that not only the trade deficits, not only importing cheap and slave labor from China, but as you pointed out, there's a fentanyl crisis. Is he using that as an excuse? Possibly. But I do think, with 100,000 people dying every year, it's a pretty legitimate crisis.
Do you think perhaps this is another example of, we did see that flurry of executive actions in the early days and weeks of the second Trump administration? I mean, do you think perhaps the lesson in all of this is perhaps there needed to be a little bit less haste with regards to signing those executive orders and really perhaps thinking them through and perhaps pushing them through in a more considered and careful way?
I think, there's some merit to that, Tom, and I think a lot of his critics especially will argue that. But this president was elected, on a few big issues, and I think that the speed and scale of what he's doing is what people voted for. It's even impressed me. I didn't expect this kind of speed and this kind of scale, but I do think that's what the voters want, and that's one of the reasons he was elected. So I think, if he's going to hit a few speed bumps, if he's going to push the envelope too far in some respects, go at it. That's what people want. Throw a grenade in the room, and if he gets pushed back by the courts here and there, so be it. But I think he'll continue with this kind of aggressive, unorthodox methodology, and I think that so far the voters appreciate that.
Companies don't seem to appreciate it too much because they don't know where they stand, and the art of forecasting is pretty difficult anyway. But it's been made even more difficult. I mean, really, a lot of companies can't forecast for the year ahead when they simply don't know where they stand.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think, companies want certainty, and they're not getting it right now. There needs to be some clarity. That's why I hope, the sooner the better that these trade deals are negotiated and announced. The markets obviously respond well to certainty. They don't like uncertainty, that's for sure. But also, at the corporate level, it's a great point. It's difficult to plan when you don't know what your costs are going to be and your inputs will be. So I think there is some merit to that, that so far so good in terms of, getting to the end zone, getting to the end game, but the process has been volatile, and hopefully, as we see more deals announced, you'll see some clarity to the markets, clarity to the corporate decision makers, which will be helpful for the real economy, not just the markets.
Okay, Greg, just to sort of wrap up this conversation, we've concluded next step is most likely an appeal by the Trump administration. Well, it's almost a certainty. Let's look a little beyond that, though. Do you see this whole episode as having damaged brand USA? And does it perhaps feed into that narrative that some countries might be feeling right now, that the United States is not a reliable trade partner?
Well, yeah, I think there's some truth to that, because this is new. This is very different than what we've seen from administrations from either political party for a long time. And I think that the problem is, if we just went with the status quo that was basically unsustainable, running these massive trade deficits, it's just not something that we could continue to fund with our, with $36 trillion in debt. So I think, something had to be done. It's disruptive. Yes, I think some trading partners will be upset, but they should have been upset, 5 or 10 or 30 years ago, when they put trade policies in place that were unfair and not necessarily free trade, but not unfree and unfair trade. So I think that there has to be some disruption right now. I would imagine that trading partners ultimately will adjust to that and understand that they can't continue to run massive trade surpluses with the U.S. But it is disruptive. I get that, and I think again, hopefully there'll be some clarity to the tariffs and other non-tariff trade barriers in the short term.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure talking to you, Greg Swenson, Chair of Republicans Overseas. Thanks for taking the time to speak to us.
Great to see you.
We're going to turn our attention now to the ongoing row between Harvard University and the Trump administration, which has sought to block the Ivy League school from hosting international students. Well, Harvard has argued that the move violates freedom of speech and due process under the US Constitution. Well, the Trump administration, meanwhile, accuses Harvard of bias against conservatives, fostering anti-Semitism on campus, and coordinating with the Chinese Communist Party. Well, let's get more on all of this. We can speak to Alan Dershowitz, who is a Harvard University Law Professor Emeritus and former attorney to President Trump. Professor Dershowitz, I imagine you've got some pretty strong opinions, given that you have a very long association with Harvard University. But let me start by asking you, what's your understanding of how it's come to this point between Harvard University and the Trump administration?
Well, both sides have overreacted and refused to come to the bargaining table. Obviously, this thing should be and can be resolved through negotiation. The Trump administration has gone much, much too far in trying to terminate all visas. Why should visas be terminated from scientists, people who might help us cure cancer or do other good things for humanity? And why should a visa, for example, be turned down from a student from Israel or a Jewish student from Great Britain? The general proposal is much, much too broad. On the other hand, legally, Trump is going to win, for better or worse. The government has the right to determine who comes into the country and who doesn't. Every country in the world has restrictions on who can come in and who can't. When we have people apply for green cards or visas, we generally ask them about their views. So this is not a First Amendment issue. Nobody's depriving anybody of their First Amendment rights to speak. They are being deprived of their non-right to come into the country. So this thing should be negotiated. We should have targeted visa denials. That is, visa denials for students who are going to be disruptive, who are going to harass other students, who are preventing other students from coming to class, who are disrupting classes. But we shouldn't have broad denials of all visas to all foreign students. That just goes much too far.
Right. I mean, 27% of students at Harvard are in the category of being international students. At least that's the latest
right.
number I saw. I mean, surely out of that 27%, we're talking about a very small percentage of people that would fall into your definition of disruptive or harassing other students.
Yeah, probably a larger percentage would fall into the category of people that the United States could properly exclude for one reason or another legally. But I agree with you that the vast majority of foreign students, and I've taught thousands of foreign students in my 60 years at Harvard, contribute enormously to diversity, enormously to the intellectual atmosphere of the school. I always loved to have foreign students in my class. I taught law for years and would always call on foreign students to give a comparative basis to American law, and that enriched the classes enormously. So I think it goes much too far to put the brake on all foreign students.
How much do you think this is about substance, and how much of this is about optics and playing up to that, or fulfilling that pledge and that electoral promise of a hardline stance on immigration?
It's impossible to separate the two. There is a serious problem at Harvard. Harvard has become an institution of the hard left. Its faculty is very, very left-wing. Its student body is very left-wing. And we don't have a kind of intellectual diversity that would make the school an even better place. But then, of course, politics plays into it too, because the average voter hates Harvard. $53 billion endowment. Why are they getting federal funds? So it's a no-lose proposition for the administration politically. But I think both Harvard are hurt and the United States is hurt by having too broad an application of these untargeted punishments. So we ought to target them and make sure that they're directed only at people who are causing the problems, legitimate, real problems. When students are prevented from going to class, when two students prevented an Israeli student from moving on the campus and threatened him and harassed him, and then both of them got rewarded, one by being the class marshal at Harvard Law School's graduation ceremony for the divinity school, and the other getting a $65,000 scholarship. These are students who should have been disciplined. They weren't exercising a First Amendment right. They were blocking somebody from exercising their First Amendment right, and they were rewarded. So, there is a problem at Harvard, but it shouldn't overreact to the problem by punishing innocent people.
Right, and Professor Dershowitz, I mean, how has it come to this point? How and why did Harvard suddenly lurch to the left? To what would you attribute that?
Oh, it's not sudden. I came to Harvard in 1964. It was a very conservative institution at the time. And over time, starting with the Vietnam War, the faculty moved leftward. And then they started appointing lots of administrators. When I came to Harvard, there were faculty and there were students, and there were a small number of administrators. Now there are an enormous number of administrators. I think they outnumber the faculty, and many of them are hard left people. And so these are people who hate America. These are people who hate Christianity. These are people who hate Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic religions. They hate religion in general. There's a lot of that at Harvard. There's a lot of the Democratic Socialists of America, who are an anarchistic organization. But all universities have that. Columbia is worse. NYU has it. Harvard is the most famous university in the world. So inevitably, it's going to be the target of any punitive actions.
Right, and we tend to think of universities as being places where students, go through various phases in their, political belief system, and they experiment with different political beliefs, and it's part of their rite of passage of growing up. And you mentioned the Vietnam War protests, which are sort of synonymous with university life in the United States, in the minds of people around the world. Yep. But what you're saying is you don't have an issue with students taking to the streets and waving banners. You've got an issue with perhaps the way things were handled more specifically by the university. Is that what it boils down to?
I don't have any problem with students waving banners. I've defended students who've waved banners. I defended Palestinian students at Harvard who could not fly the flag, the Palestinian flag, when Yasser Arafat died. I don't mix my politics with my constitutional law. No problem about waving banners. There is a problem about blocking access to classes. There is a problem about kidnapping janitors, as was done at Columbia. And I represented a lot of protesters during the Vietnam War, but some of them ultimately became violent murderers. Kathy Boudin became a murderer. The Weathermen started planting bombs. And what we saw the other day when this killer murdered two people from the Israeli embassy, I predicted that that might happen when I saw the kind of violence that was accompanying some of the anti-Israel demonstrations on campus. So I think there's a legitimate concern that violent protests can turn into even more violent killings, as occurred in the District of Columbia.
You say that a lot of universities in the United States are quite left-leaning. Have you seen and heard messages of solidarity for Harvard coming from other institutions across the US? Is that something that's being played out in the media there?
Yeah, it's because the Trump administration has overreacted. And that, indeed, there was an article in the paper the other day that Harvard is coming together more than ever before, because whatever side you're on the Israel issue and on liberal conservative issues, you don't want to see Harvard destroyed. And so a lot of conservative professors or pro-Israel professors are now siding with Harvard because they don't want to side with the Trump administration. I think that's true of universities around the country. They're supporting Harvard not because they think Harvard did everything perfectly right, but because as between Harvard and the Trump administration, they want to make sure that Harvard preserves its status as a great institution of learning and as a great research center where cures for all kinds of diseases may very well be developed over the years and could be stopped by some of the defunding that's going on now, because that also is not targeted. Instead of defunding the schools or the programs that have perpetrated anti-Semitism, anti-Americanism, they have broadly defunded everything, and that will stop important research from going forward. So the bottom line generally is, if you're going to have sanctions against the university, make them targeted, make them focus on the evildoers, not on the innocent people who are doing good research and promoting proper educational policies.
Right, and there are probably kids all over the world trying to find out whether or not they're going to study in the United States or not, queuing up outside embassies. Probably in those embassies, there's a degree of confusion as to what visas can be issued and which cannot be issued. But do you think all of this and this whole debate and this perception that, centers of academic excellence are being somehow, they're coming under attack from the very top in the United States? I mean, do you think the brand US as a destination to study abroad risks being damaged and therefore losing out to other countries where people might think, well, it's too risky to study in America. I want to go and study in China or in India or indeed anywhere else?
A, there's no question that's happening. But B, I think most Americans would probably say that too many foreigners are studying at American universities, because every spot taken by a foreigner is a spot taken away from an American. So when you have an administration that's America first, and you have an attitude by many Americans, as you have in every country in the world, that their country comes first, you do see some sympathy for at least cutting back on the number of foreign students. When I started teaching at Harvard, there were handfuls of foreign students, and today it's up to, according to some statistics, 27%, other statistics, 33%. Don't know where the truth lies, but it's a very, very, very substantial increase. And some of it is on merit. Some of it is for financial reasons. And so we're seeing a combination of things. Number one, a lot of Americans think there are too many foreign students in American schools. And number two, a lot of Americans think that too many of those students, although it's a small percentage, are creating the kind of disruptions that are hurting American universities. So it's a perfect storm that's hurting foreign students in different ways.
When you hear the Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, talking about Harvard fostering violence, anti-Semitism, and coordinating with the Chinese Communist Party, do you agree with all of what she's saying or just a fraction of it?
I've never heard about the communist parties. I never met anybody who was associated with the Chinese Communist Party in my 60 years.
We can rule that one out. We can rule that one out then.
I think so. There is one organization on campus and all over the country. It's called Code Pink, which has had an affiliation with the Chinese Communist Party, but they're a tiny, largely uninfluential country. I don't think that's a real problem. I think the real problem is both homegrown and foreign students who see disruption as a proper way of protesting what's going on in Gaza and other places. And political protests are fine. They're part of the American Constitution. But violent protests that don't permit students to go to class and that discriminate based on religion or race are not acceptable. And that's why it's important to have targeted responses.
What does Harvard have to do, in your opinion? What would you like to see a school with which you have a long and presumably affectionate attachment? What do they need to do to bring about a reset and a rethink on the part of the Trump administration and put this whole saga to bed?
Two things. First, they have to sit down and offer to negotiate and say that we're prepared to make certain compromises. Then they ought to offer compromises. First, greater emphasis on meritocracy, hiring faculty and admitting students based on their own merit, not on the basis of racial and other criteria, gender criteria. Second, do away with teaching concepts like intersectionality and DEI and critical race theory, which have fostered an atmosphere in the Harvard campus of bigotry and anti-Semitism. There's a lot of things Harvard could do, and the president of Harvard is anxious to do it. He would like to see Harvard become a place where students get along better and where we have more ideological diversity. That's the key. Ideological diversity. If 97% of the Harvard faculty are to the left and they use their politics in the classroom, there's something very wrong. I don't care what people's politics are. I don't care what my doctor's politics are, as long as he or she doesn't allow it to influence the way I get treated. The same thing with teaching. For 60 years at Harvard, I never expressed a personal view in my classroom. Students had no idea whether I was pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, whether I was a Republican or a Democrat. I just wouldn't allow my own personal views ever to enter into classroom discussions, because my job was to teach them not what to think, but how to think critically, how to become better conservatives if they were conservative, better liberals if they were liberals. And I think we have to see a return to that kind of teaching if we're going to see an end to this dispute between government and universities.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, given, an institution like the Harvard Law School is so prestigious, and of course you know it better than anyone else probably on earth, given that the professors there are the very professors who, in many cases, likely taught the top judges across the United States or gave some legal instruction to them at some stage in their careers. Who do you see coming out on top in all of this if, this legal battle rumbles on? Is it going to be Team Harvard and its band of law professors who are presumably very much on board with, well, perhaps they're not, but correct me if I'm wrong, who are perhaps on board with Harvard's cause? Or do you see the Trump administration coming out on top in all of this?
It depends on whether you think about short-term or long-term. Short-term, Trump wins. He's going to get the Supreme Court to support almost all of his innovations, including visa restrictions and including restrictions on funding. Long-term, Harvard wins. Harvard is older than the United States. It will endure beyond any particular administration, but it will be wounded. And the way to prevent that wound from spreading is for Harvard to take action internally to present its student body with a far more diverse faculty and a far more diverse administration. And I think Harvard is trying hard to do that. That's a long-term effort. It will not happen during the Trump administration. So Trump will win while he's in office, and that's what he obviously is concerned about. But ultimately, Harvard will prevail.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. Alan Dershowitz, Harvard University Law Professor Emeritus and former attorney to President Trump. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Well, let's bring into the conversation Andrew Gould, who is a former Arizona Supreme Court Justice who joins us from Arizona. Justice Gould, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Let's start by talking about the funding of Harvard and what these latest rulings mean for Harvard's funding. Where is Harvard right now and can it survive?
Well, Harvard can certainly survive. It has $53 billion in private endowments. What's at issue is about $2.6 billion in grants. Now, the federal government has tremendous discretion over whether or not they provide grants. Here, the federal government, DHS, has said you cannot discriminate against Jewish students and expect the federal government to allocate you federal grants. The federal government doesn't subsidize discrimination. And so that's the basis of it. There's a hearing set for this in July, and so we'll see where it comes out in the courts.
Right, you bring up one of the underlying reasons for this tussle between the White House and this prestigious ancient American seat of academic excellence. One of them being, of course, the perception that there's been a failure to police anti-Semitism on campus. What does Harvard need to do to bring about a rethink by the Trump administration, or is it too late?
It's not too late. Harvard, Tom, could solve this problem today. What the administration has asked them to do is to investigate some of the international or foreign students that have come on campus that have association with terrorist groups, Hamas groups. Investigate, look at what's going on, and do have associations, those that have associations with groups that are anti-Semitic, to screen them and not allow them on campus. Secondly, they want some action. There's been a lot of talk on the Harvard campus, but no action. They renamed the DEI department. That's all well and good, but Jewish students still walk around on campus terrified from physical and verbal threats. In fact, two of the students that assaulted a Jewish student on October 18th, 2023, who are actually charged with battery, have been rewarded by Harvard. One of them is a law student, and Harvard gave that student a postgraduate grant to work for CARE. Another student who's a divinity student, they named him a special marshal for commencement. Tom, imagine if this had been an assault against any other minority group. Let's say it was an assault by white students on a black student, and Harvard University rewarding one student with a postgraduate grant and naming the other a marshal for commencement. And so it's this ongoing behavior that's the problem. And Harvard needs to stop. They need to take it seriously, and they need to take concrete action to stop the anti-Semitism. But again, as I said earlier, Harvard seems dead set on discriminating against Jewish students and fighting it in the court so they can.
The Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, went further than you have gone in her criticism of Harvard. She accuses the university of, quote, fostering violence, anti-Semitism, that tallies with what you're saying, and coordinating, she says, with the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, do you agree with that as well?
I haven't looked into that issue with the Chinese Communist Party. I saw the letter from DHS. I can speak to the anti-Semitism on campus because I've been involved in these cases. I'm involved in a case at UCLA. It's all across the country, but I think one could strongly argue Harvard is the worst example because they've had some of the worst violence there. They've had student groups that are closely associated with Hamas and terrorist groups, and the university has done nothing to keep outside protesters out. I mean, it's private property, Tom, at Harvard, and they're allowing people that aren't even students at the school to come in and lead these protests. And although the encampment was last spring, and there's been a receding in some of this violence in terms of verbal threats and physical threats, it still continues. And here's the problem, Tom. All of the structures remain in place for it to happen again. You still have the same departments. You still have the same ideas being taught at the school, the same indoctrination. You still have a lack of accountability at the school for these actions. And then you have the proactive actions of Harvard, as I just mentioned, 2 students that were actually charged with battery and assault, and the university commending them and giving them grants. So although things have receded, there's still problems. Jewish students are terrified to walk around on campus, and there's nothing to stop it from getting worse again.
Right, you say it's private property. Does the government therefore have the power to revoke Harvard's visa certification?
Yes, because that's a program that's run by DHS. Of course they can revoke those visas. Of course they can change that. They have authority. Executive branch has authority under that program. It's been delegated to the executive branch, to DHS, to oversee those programs. And so they certainly can. Look, Harvard, again, can stop this today if they will cooperate with the administration, but they have ignored the administration's requests. That the administration has specifically asked, please investigate and look into these students coming from foreign countries that are anti-Semitic, that have ties or association with terrorist groups, and they have refused to do it. So they can continue to operate under their private endowments, but if they want to work with the administration on programs like the SEVP program, that's the International Student Program, or if they want to get grants, they can't discriminate against Jewish students. And that's really all the administration is saying.
Harvard University, and we've alluded to the fact that it's commencement season right across the United States, holding its 374th commencement today. That's this Thursday. And yesterday we had the NBA great Karim Abdul-Jabbar giving a class day speech there. And I just want to read you a piece from what he said. He said, when a tyrannical administration tries to bully and threaten Harvard to revoke their academic freedom and to destroy freedom of speech, he said that Dr. Alan Jabbar, that's the head of Harvard, had rejected the illegal and immoral pressures. And he called out the institutions in America that have conceded to this administration, calling the administration one that had systematically strip-mined the US Constitution. Are those words you ever thought you'd hear in America? And how do you react to them?
I never thought I would hear them, Tom. And what I would ask Mr. Jabbar, who is a great basketball player, is if a group of Black students were spit on and assaulted and harassed day and night by a group of white students, what would you want Harvard to do then? How would you react to that? If it was a group of LGBTQ plus students who were being harassed day and night, like these Jewish students, some of them are afraid to even leave their dorm rooms. How would you react to that? We have a First Amendment in the Constitution. It doesn't protect assaulting people and attacking people. We also have a 14th Amendment in the United States Constitution that provides due process and equal protection of the laws. We also have a Civil Rights Act, Title VII, that prohibits private institutions from discriminating against people based on race or religion or national origin. Let's not be selective about who's protected by that just because you don't like a certain group or you support one group's speech. So frankly, I find Mr. Jabbar's statement offensive, and in fact, it goes against the United States Constitution. It goes against everything the United States stands for. These Jewish students are being discriminated against. They're being physically and verbally assaulted. And the Trump administration is trying to step in and get Harvard to protect them and treat them like anybody else.
Just moving our attention back towards the Chinese students, because we've heard from the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio that he wants to start, quote, aggressively revoking visas for Chinese students. I mean, this is on various different grounds, espionage, intellectual property theft being two of them. But what do you understand as being the consequences of a move like that? And an extension of that question is really, could this undermine the attractiveness of the United States as a place for international students to want to go and study?
Well, the consequences are if their visas are revoked, they obviously can't come to the United States and study. Now, I think that they can also transfer to different institutions and maintain that visa status. But if the sanctions are against Harvard, they can't continue to go to Harvard under the visa. In terms of the attractiveness of coming to the United States, let's be frank, Tom. The United States educates the world. Our universities are fantastic. There's many other great institutions, but we're the educator of the world in higher education and science, and in many, many ways. And I mean no disrespect to any other country. There are other very fine institutions as well. But it is not our responsibility as a country to bring people into this to our institutions that are engaging in espionage, spying, serving a foreign government to provide all kinds of information about our intellectual property, nor is it our responsibility, or should we, be bringing people into this country to study at our universities who are tied to terrorist organizations, anti-Semitic organizations, or any other organization that discriminates against people based on race, religion, or national origin. I think ultimately it upholds the integrity of our educational institutions to say we don't stand for that. We're not institutions that discriminate. We protect people's civil rights, and we're going to protect the national security of this country. So it would be absurd for this country or any of our educational institutions to take a contrary position. So I think ultimately, Tom, it's a good thing, and it makes people respect this country and makes people want to come to this country to be at institutions that don't discriminate.
Just looking forward as to what happens next, I mean, a little bit of speculation required here on your part, if you don't mind. I mean, where do you see things heading to? Do you think Harvard is likely to cave, not just under the social pressure and the legal pressures, but under the financial pressure as well?
I don't think so, Tom. The financial pressures, again, they are the most heavily endowed private institution of any university. They have $53 billion. And so I think they're flexing their muscles in that regard. In terms of any indications that they're willing to compromise or stop the discrimination, I haven't seen it yet. And so I think they're going to continue forward. I think they're going to fight this all the way in the courts. Who wins? Ultimately, as I've mentioned before, facts are stubborn things. And when you have an institution that is allowing discrimination against Jewish students, has taken no concrete action to stop it, and then on the other side, you have a federal government that has discretion in how it distributes these grants and how it administers these visa programs, I think it's highly likely that Harvard is going to lose. That being said, there may be some distinctions amongst classes of the visa students that the courts might carve out. There might be some distinctions in some of the types of grants where the link between Harvard's discriminatory actions and those grants may not be as clear. So there may be some line drawing in this. Ultimately, I will tell you this, Tom, it would be my hope that at some point Harvard would step back and realize this is a bad course to go on. They shouldn't be stubborn about this, and they should try to work with the Trump administration. I have said this before. This could all end today with simply being willing to make some concrete steps to stop the discrimination against these students, these Jewish students. But if Harvard is dead set on continuing to discriminate, then this is going to be fought out in the courts for months and maybe years to come.
Yeah, and Justice Gould, this is my last question. I know you've sort of covered some of this already, but I mean, really for the benefit of our viewers, emphasizing the point that Harvard is this center of academic excellence, known the world over. It's got this extremely prestigious law school. And I'm imagining that the very professors of law at the Harvard Law School trained and taught some of the judges who will have an impact on what course this legal battle takes. I mean, when you look at it in those terms, I mean, do you think that the Harvard judges, the Harvard team is going to come out on top?
Well, there's a lot more judges out there than Harvard judges. I went to Northwestern. I'm not a Harvard judge, and so I don't think that because a lot of judges on the bench now went to Harvard, that's going to determine the result. What I will say, and I think you raised an excellent point, is what a tragedy that such a prestigious institution, Harvard Law School, to think of Harvard Law School and how it has behaved under in these circumstances and how it has trained these young lawyers. It's a tragedy that we do have a whole generation of young lawyers, and even some now that are currently on the bench, that see this activity as anything other than unconstitutional, that are absolutely offended and shocked that an institution like Harvard would allow this discrimination to go on. And yet there is an impact that they've had in training these lawyers, a tremendous impact. And to me, Tom, that's a tragedy. As a lawyer, I've been a judge and a lawyer for 35 years. It saddens me to see that that's the direction that law school has taken.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Really appreciate it. Retired Justice Andrew Gould, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, it is, of course, a Thursday today, which is the day of the week when we take a look back at some of the top stories that have been making waves in the United States. And we were just talking there about what's been happening in this row between the Trump administration and Harvard University. Let's bring Angie Wong into the conversation, as we do often on this channel. Great to have you back with us here on Al Arabiya English. Angie Wong, you are, of course, a Republican committee member based in Miami, in Florida. Just on the back of that discussion we were just having about Harvard, I mean, I want to read the same quote that I read to our other guests, which is a quote from the Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, who accuses Harvard of, quote, fostering violence, anti-Semitism, and coordinating with the Chinese Communist Party. What do you make of all of that?
I think Kristi Noem had built in a very, very loaded sentence there. There's so much there that we have to dissect. Anti-Semitism, CCP-backed students. I think there's a lot of cross-messaging just in that one sentence. Ultimately, what we do know is that Secretary of State Marco Rubio had just put a pause on all foreign students coming into the United States until they are properly vetted, which I feel that is absolutely comfortable because we vet everyone coming into the United States, including asylum seekers and potential employees in U.S. firms. So why wouldn't we do the same for foreign students? I think that's a good thing. Now, the CCP and anti-Semitism in campuses, those are two other issues that's been loaded into this. So I think Kristi Noem should know better than to just lump everything into one big soundbite because she knows that it's going to make the press. I think she does need to kind of talk through those topics that she wants to make Americans aware of and American universities.
So do you reckon this is a case of the Trump administration sort of banging that hardline immigration drum really to please and to show the support base that they're delivering? Do you think it's more about the optics than it is about the substance?
I think it's more about the politics. I think Kristi Noem is a political animal. She knows that Trump has an issue with the Chinese, especially now during the times of tariffs and trade wars that we're seeing. And also he wants to combat anti-Semitism that's happening across the US. And we're seeing them all in a lot of our campuses that are out of control now. This is beyond free speech. This is not why you were given the privilege as a foreign student to come here to study. And but they're using free speech as if they had it. You know, I couldn't go into another country and bang my fists and criticize the local government. I'd be lucky if I just got deported, right? There could be a whole lot of things that could happen as a foreigner in a different country. So I think that this is about respecting the privilege that you have coming here on the invitation of the United States, and you better behave yourself.
Do you think there's a risk, though, that this whole chapter is somehow tarnishing the reputation of the United States as a place that people might want to, you know, pay a lot of money to get to and then study in, when they could go to other places that seem a little bit more welcome and friendly?
We're definitely going to be seeing that the same way we've seen a dip in tourism. Summer tourism has dropped, and that is what we're going to see throughout the next few months here in the U.S. Same thing with students. They are not welcomed here. That's what the Trump administration is saying, and that's a pretty hard line. But you know, I'm sure that the UK universities are happy for this messaging. I'm sure the Australian schools there are also happy to welcome a lot of foreign students in. This is going to be just a warning to all US universities, because I don't think that this is going to last very long. I think the universities will cave in. So many of these universities depend on foreign students coming in just to make their budget. Forgetting Harvard with its $53 billion endowment. What about the smaller colleges that will be affected?
Yeah, of course, Harvard has about 27% of its student body from foreign countries. Let's move on to another subject that I wanted to discuss with you, Angie. Elon Musk is stepping down from his role in the Trump administration. I mean, we knew that was going to happen. It was an inevitability because there was a set period of time, wasn't there, for how long he could be in that role. But just remind us why he's moving aside.
Well, as a special employee of the federal government, you can only be there for 130 days, and that time has lapsed now. And he's left a great tenure. What has to happen after Elon Musk leaves is that Congress needs to pass some of the findings into bills and laws, ultimately laws for the president to sign. So I think that is what's happening. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the representative from Georgia, she's already putting things on the floor as of today from the Doge audits. So we're going to start seeing those things come to life. I think Elon Musk has done a fantastic job. He's been a great patriot in doing some of the harder works that no real government official can do. He was definitely the hatchet man who came in swinging with probably the biggest and largest digital microphone there ever was, if there ever was one, with X. And he was able to get so much of the American people to agree and to have their eyes wide open, given all the craziness that was going on with our budgets and how much money we were giving away year on year. So I think he's done a fantastic job. And now it's really left to Congress and our president to turn some of these things into law.
He's not going away, is he, entirely? I mean, do you see Elon Musk continuing to play a part in the Trump administration, perhaps behind the scenes?
I don't, actually. I think that he will be a nice golf buddy for President Trump, and they certainly text each other quite often. I think that he will be, to some extent, an advisor to Trump, because he does have Trump's ear. But ultimately, you know, he's got other jobs that he has to do, right? He's got a few companies he's got to run himself, and they don't always align with what Trump is doing, especially when during all the talks on tariffs, some of those tariffs really hurt Elon Musk's bottom line and his businesses, so much so that his board of directors called him back and said, hey, don't do that. You're going to, you know, plummet our stock. So I think that they'll always have a special relationship, but whether or not he comes on any official capacity, I highly doubt that.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's sort of noticed that this role that he's played, his involvement at politics, has come at a pretty enormous personal cost to Mr. Musk and his business ventures. Do you think anyone saw that coming?
I think he was having a lot of fun. I think that both men were having a great time together fixing our country. And again, you do need those massive disruptors early on to create the chaos just to rebuild. And I think that's the phase we're in now. We're in Act 2 of this. So the hatchet men came in, they found all the fraud, they found the waste, they pointed it out and blasted out on social media. Now it's really time to clean up that mess and see what is actually needed, what is not needed, and how do we save the government some money, which really means how do we save taxpayer dollars and put more money into the saving accounts of Americans. So I think all of this is a good thing. I think that his legacy will continue even beyond his 130 days in Washington.
So it sounds like you think the Doge experiment is going to go down in history as having been a successful chapter.
I think so. I think it really just opened everyone's eyes to what kind of waste was going on within our government. And it took a billionaire like Elon Musk to actually put this out there. He doesn't care. He barely has skin in the game here. He just wanted to expose the fraud. And you can see the joys, almost like a journalist exposing fraudsters. He loved it. And I think that President Trump gave him a lot of leeway to do so. And now we're going to see who takes over Doge. I've heard a few names thrown out there, but I'm sure whoever his successor will be to heading Doge, they're going to do a fantastic job because this is what President Trump wants. This is what American people voted him for, and he's getting it done. And every single day, his approval ratings are jumping up because of it.
Let's move on to the third and final topic I wanted to discuss with you, which is the exchange, shall we say, between Presidents Trump and Putin throughout the course of this week. The week began with President Trump calling President Putin crazy. We got a response from the Kremlin. They were saying that President Trump, they were suggesting that perhaps President Trump was getting a little emotional. What struck you about that slightly unusual exchange?
Well, I think Putin smells weakness. He took a look around the room, or rather around the globe, and said, well, the EU is not going to really do anything, and NATO won't do anything without the U.S. intervention, and they're not going to invite Ukraine in anytime soon. And he looked at Trump and said, well, I had a 2-hour phone call with President Trump, and I don't think he's going to commit any U.S. troops to this or any additional U.S. money. So I'm just going to keep playing until someone stops me. Whereas Trump, what he wanted out of this phone call with Putin was to be the ultimate deal maker. And Putin is definitely not letting him have his cake there. So that's why they're doing these name callings. I mean, look, to call President Trump emotional, those are war words when it comes to how President Trump likes to be perceived. So they're going to be doing these back and forths, but ultimately, I think Trump might have been checked here, in that there's really nothing that he can do, Putin, unless he commits U.S. troops. Germany has already signified that they don't really want to get involved. They kind of dip their toes in. The EU has said, we're not really going to do anything. So what is Trump's playing cards? I think his leverage is lessening day by day on this. He may be looking for an exit plan out of getting involved in the Ukraine-Russia conflict.
So I'm wondering how this is all played out in the United States and how people, particularly in the GOP, where there was, there has been some admiration for President Putin from some ranks of the Republican Party. Has this been covered extensively? And do you think views of President Putin have perhaps shifted in the last few days?
I think people are really understanding who Putin really is. For about a month or two since Volodymyr Zelensky visited the White House and had a clash with J.D. Vance, President Trump, and Marco Rubio, he did not walk out of Washington very favorable. But now we see Putin is playing with Trump, and Trump is doing everything he can to leverage himself to get Putin to the negotiating table. Trump tried to go after Putin's key allies, Iran and China, and it doesn't seem to be making Putin jump at all. In fact, he dodged the Turkey meeting that was supposed to take place a few weeks ago. Nothing is going to get Putin to the table unless he knows that he has to, and I think Trump is looking for that right now. If he can't find that leverage, I think he's going to try to find a graceful exit from this, because I don't know if anyone can really solve this. And there's really no governing body that is willing to step up to Putin at this time. Only Trump can do it. And I don't know if he wants to take that kind of political capital and use it, as in sending troops or more US dollars to Ukraine.
Yeah, and just lastly, I mean, obviously improving ties with Moscow is something that President Trump set out to do quite quickly in his administration, and the two sides had more than one round of talks. I mean, do you see that process, that rapprochement, continuing, or do you think it's reached a point that it simply can't go much further than how far it's got so far?
Yeah, President Trump for sure likes to have that rapport with Putin, and he likes that he has that rapport with Zelensky. He thinks he could be the ultimate deal maker in this, and that is still for discussion. And I think he still wants to make it happen, but it has to happen under different circumstances. At this point, it's like, what are the options here? More money into the war machine, giving Putin what he wants, or taking an exit strategy, which I'm seeing the signals of that. I'm seeing, the early audits of the Ukraine money that the US has given, the blank checks. We're starting to hear rumbles now in Washington about doing audits, mainly just to whet the appetite of American viewers to say, look, no more money. We don't want to get involved in this. This is not our war. And I think that might be a strategy that might be taken, and maybe something that, Tom, you and I will be discussing in weeks ahead.
All right, look forward to that. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Angie Wong, Republican committee member in Miami. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, that brings you up to date. We've talked tariffs, we've talked about the Harvard row, we've talked about Elon Musk's legacy. We've even touched on where all of the latest exchanges between Moscow and Washington leave ties between Presidents Trump and Putin. That's it for Global News today. Thanks for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for a look back at the best interviews of the week. Thanks for watching.